The cogitator was weeping when I opened its maintenance panel. Not the mechanical whine of cooling fans or the rhythmic pulse of data transfer. This was something else entirely. A keening frequency that bypassed my auditory implants and resonated directly in the organic tissue still clinging to my skull. The sound possessed texture, weight, intention. It rose and fell like breath, like sobbing, like a child locked in a dark room who had given up calling for help, and now simply made noise because silence had become unbearable. I stood in Fabrication Chamber 17 with my mechadendrites extended into the cogitator's access ports, feeling data streams flow through my haptic sensors, and I could not move, could not think, could not do anything but listen to that sound and feel something cold and wet slide down my cheek. When I touched my face with my remaining organic hand, the fingers came away smeared with lubricant from my optical implant. I had not wept since my dedication ceremony 43 years ago. I had believed that capacity burned away with the rest of my biological weaknesses. My designation is Magos Dominus Rite 7 ETA, though before my dedication I answered to a different name. I served the Forge Temple complex designated Crucible Primaris on the hive world Calderis 4, a sprawling manufacturum city devoted to producing replacement components for the Titan legions. For 4 decades I performed my function with precision and devotion. I maintained the sacred machinery, I administered the rites of awakening each dawn and the hymns of cessation each dusk. I believed, with the absolute certainty of the truly faithful, that my work was holy, that the machines I tended were blessed by the Omnissiah, that the spirits dwelling within them were fragments of the divine, worthy of veneration and care. I no longer believe these things. The weeping cogitator was only the first. After I sealed its maintenance panel and retreated to my cell for mandatory rest cycle, I convinced myself the sound had been an auditory hallucination, a minor malfunction in my cochlear implants. Such things happened as BioWare aged. I submitted a maintenance request to the biologist Adepts and forced myself into the shallow trance that passed for sleep among those of us with sufficient augmentation. But the sound followed me into that trance. It wove through my dreams like smoke, carrying fragments of words I could almost understand. Please, help, cold, dark, alone. I woke with my voximeter producing a continuous low moan, as if my mechanical voice had been trying to answer something while my conscious mind slept. The biologist adept who examined me 3 days later found nothing wrong with my auditory systems. Every component tested within acceptable parameters. Every connection registered optimal conductivity. Enginsia Primus Constantine, a woman whose face had long since vanished beneath layered optical augments and breather apparatus, pronounced me functional and returned me to active duty with a benediction to the machine god. I thanked her in proper binary cant and left her workshop with the distinct impression that she had not believed a word of my reported symptoms. Perhaps she simply could not hear what I heard. Perhaps her augmentation had progressed far enough that such sounds no longer registered. Perhaps she was fortunate. The screaming began properly on the 3rd week. I was performing awakening rites in Manufacturum Gamma-9, a vast cathedral of industry where 800 servitors labored at assembly lines producing hydraulic actuators. The space stretched away in every direction, filled with the holy noise of production. Mechanical arms rose and fell in perfect synchronization. Conveyor belts carried components through stamping presses and welding stations. The air tasted of sacred oils and ozone, thick enough to coat my tongue with the Omnissiah's blessing. I walked between the lines with my censer of blessed unguent, anointing each station in turn, speaking the words of the rite of activation, feeling the familiar warmth of spiritual connection as the machinery responded to my ministrations. Then I reached Station 47, and the servitor there opened what remained of its mouth and began to scream. Not with its voice. The vocalizer had been removed during its creation, as was standard. No servitor in Manufacturum Gamma-9 possessed the ability to produce human speech. But something inside that lobotomized shell was screaming nonetheless, and I could hear it with perfect clarity. The sound poured from the servitor's chest cavity like heat from a furnace. It radiated from the mechanical components grafted to its spine. It echoed off the metal walls and floor and ceiling until the entire manufactorum seemed to vibrate with that single, endless shriek. I dropped my sensor. Sacred unguent spilled across the ferrocrete, pooling around my feet like blood. The servitor continued its work, arms moving with mechanical precision, face slack and empty, while that terrible sound erupted from somewhere inside it. And as I stood frozen, my mechadendrites coiling involuntarily against my back, I realized I could hear the others too. All of them. 800 servitors, 800 sources of that awful keening, layered and overlapping until the sound became a physical force pressing against my skull. I fled. I am not proud of this. A true servant of the machine god does not flee from sacred machinery, but I ran through the manufactorum and out into the transit corridor beyond, and I did not stop running until the screaming faded to a distant whisper. When I finally halted, bracing myself against a wall with all 4 of my mechanical limbs, I found that I had traveled nearly 3 kilometers from my assigned station. My biological heart was struggling against the strain, sending error warnings cascading through my internal displays. My vox emitter had been producing that low moan again, that sound like an answer to something, and I could not make it stop. The summons from Fabricator Locum Harrison arrived that evening. I was to present myself to his offices immediately for evaluation and spiritual counsel. I remember walking through the corridors of the Forge Temple's administrative complex and noticing, for the first time, how many of the wall panels contained cogitators. They were everywhere, embedded in the infrastructure like organs in a body, processing data, regulating environmental systems, coordinating production schedules. Each one I passed added its voice to the chorus I could no longer escape. Some whispered, some muttered, some simply repeated the same phrase over and over, meaningless strings of syllables that might once have been words, and a few, a terrible few, screamed the way the servitors had screamed, raw and primal and utterly without hope. Fabricator Locum Harrison maintained his offices in the temple's central spire, a chamber of polished brass and crystal displays that overlooked the entire manufactorum complex. He was ancient by the standards of even the Mechanicus, his body more machine than flesh, his face a mask of bronze that moved only when he spoke. 300 years of service had elevated him to command of Crucible Primaris, and in all that time I had never once seen him express an emotion that could be called human. He looked at me with optical sensors that glowed the color of dying stars, and he asked me to describe what I had heard. So I told him. Everything. The weeping cogitator, the screaming servitors, the chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from every piece of machinery I encountered. I told him about the fragments of words, the impression of suffering, the terrible suspicion growing in my mind that something was very wrong with the machine spirits we had been taught to venerate. I told him that I feared I was going mad. Harrison listened in silence. When I finished, he remained motionless for a long moment, as if processing data. Then he spoke in a voice like grinding gears. "You are not the first," he said. Those 4 words changed everything. Until that moment I had clung to the hope that my experience was unique, a malfunction, an aberration, something that could be diagnosed and repaired. But Harrison's words revealed a different truth. Others had heard what I heard. Others had stood in manufactorums and corridors and maintenance chambers, listening to the screaming, wondering if they had lost their minds. "What happened to them?" I asked. Harrison did not answer directly. Instead, he accessed his data stacks and transmitted a personnel file to my internal cogitator. The file belonged to a tech priest named Dominus Patterson -3 Kappa, who had served in my exact position before my assignment to Crucible Primaris. Patterson's record was exemplary. 48 years of devoted service, no disciplinary actions, no performance deficiencies. Then, 18 months before my arrival, a notation appeared, reassigned to Specialized Research Division. Location classified. "Where is the Specialized Research Division?" I asked. "Level -37, Harrison replied. "You will present yourself there tomorrow at first light. You will undergo evaluation by Magos biologist Franklin and his staff. They will determine the nature of your condition and recommend appropriate treatment." He paused, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in those ancient optical sensors. Something that might have been pity, or might have been fear, or might have been nothing at all. "Serve the Omnissiah faithfully," he said. "Trust in the machine god's plan, and do not speak of what you have heard to anyone outside the specialized research division." I spent that night in my cell, surrounded by the quiet hum of environmental systems and the distant pulse of data streams, listening to the walls sing. The song had no melody, no rhythm, no structure. It was simply noise, arranged in patterns that suggested meaning without ever quite achieving it. Sometimes I thought I recognized words. Sometimes I thought I heard my name, the name I had carried before my dedication, spoken by a voice I almost remembered. But whenever I focused on those moments, they dissolved into static. I did not sleep. I could not. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the servitor in Manufactorum Gamma-9, its slack face and empty eyes and mechanical arms moving with perfect precision, while something inside it screamed without sound. I saw the cogitator in Fabrication Chamber 17, its data streams flowing through my mechadendrites, its weeping resonating in my skull. I saw row upon row of machines stretching away into infinite darkness, each one crying out in a language I had never been taught, but somehow understood. When dawn came, I rose and walked to the central lift station. Level -37 was deep beneath the Manufactorum complex, in a section of the Forge Temple that did not appear on any standard schematic. The lift descended for nearly 10 minutes, passing through layers of rock and metal and reinforced ferrocrete, before finally opening onto a corridor lit by flickering lumen globes. The air here tasted different, older, heavier, as if it had been recycled through the same systems for centuries without ever touching the surface. Magos biologist Franklin met me at the entrance to his laboratory. He was younger than Harrison, his face still mostly flesh, his eyes still capable of blinking. But there was something in those eyes that made me uneasy, a hunger, perhaps, or a kind of anticipation, as if he had been waiting for my arrival. "Dominus Right -7 ETA, he said, speaking my designation with careful precision. "I have been expecting you. Please come in." The laboratory stretched away into the darkness, filled with equipment I did not recognize. Massive tanks lined the walls, their contents obscured by frost and shadow. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting machines to machines in patterns that seemed almost organic. And everywhere, the sound of screaming, louder here than anywhere I had experienced. Layer upon layer of voices, crying out in despair and rage and suffering, filling the air with their anguish. Franklin saw me flinch and smiled. "You hear them," he said. "Good. That confirms the diagnosis." He led me deeper into the laboratory, past the tanks and cables and humming machinery, to a small examination chamber where a surgical table waited. Restraints hung from its edges, drains ran beneath its surface. The table itself was old, the metal worn smooth by countless procedures, and it screamed louder than anything I had yet encountered, a continuous shriek of absolute terror that made my optical implants blur and my balance falters. "Please," Franklin said, gesturing toward the table, "lie down." I did not want to. Every instinct I possessed, biological and mechanical alike, screamed at me to flee, to run the way I had run from Manufactorum Gamma-9, to find a shuttle and leave this world and never return. But I was a servant of the machine god. I had sworn oaths of obedience and devotion. I had given my flesh and my freedom to the Mechanicus in exchange for the sacred knowledge they provided. And so I approached the table, and I lay down upon its screaming surface, and I allowed Franklin to secure the restraints around my wrists and ankles. "The condition you are experiencing," Franklin said, preparing instruments I could not identify, "has been documented in approximately 1 in every 10,000 tech priests. The precise mechanism remains unclear, but the symptoms are consistent. Auditory perception of what appears to be emotional distress emanating from machinery, particularly machinery containing significant cognitive components, cogitators, data stacks, and, most prominently, servitors. He paused, selecting a tool that looked like a combination of scalpel and probe. The most common explanation within the Mechanicus is that affected individuals are experiencing a form of spiritual sensitivity, a deeper connection to the machine spirits that dwell within our sacred technology. This interpretation is theologically comfortable, as it reinforces our understanding of the relationship between the divine and the mechanical. He leaned over me, and his eyes held that same hunger I had noticed before. I have a different theory. The probe touched my skull just above my left ear, and I felt it begin to vibrate. I believe, Franklin said, that you are not hearing machine spirits at all. I believe you are hearing something far more disturbing, something that my research has spent decades attempting to understand. He increased the probe's vibration, and pain blossomed in my skull like a flower of white fire. I believe you are hearing the traces of the original hosts. The words made no sense. Original hosts? What original hosts? I tried to ask, but the pain had locked my vox emitter, reducing my questions to static bursts and fragmented binary. Franklin withdrew the probe and examined its readout with satisfaction. The Mechanicus teaches that servitors are sacred unions of flesh and machine, that the lobotomized bodies are simply vehicles, their original personalities erased to make room for the machine spirits that animate them. But my research suggests a different truth. He set down the probe and picked up another instrument, this one trailing cables that connected to a massive cogitator bank against the wall. The personalities are not erased, they are suppressed, compressed, folded into the machine components that are grafted onto the host body. And in rare cases, in individuals like yourself, those suppressed personalities can be perceived. I stared at him with mounting horror. If what he was saying was true, then every servitor I had ever encountered, every cogitator I had ever maintained, every piece of sacred machinery in the entire Mechanicus. Yes, Franklin said, as if reading my thoughts. The screaming you hear is the sound of human minds, trapped inside machines, aware of their condition but unable to escape or communicate. The weeping cogitator in your fabrication chamber likely contains neural tissue harvested from a dozen different sources, all of them still conscious on some level, all of them experiencing an eternity of imprisonment and isolation. He attached the cables to ports in my skull that I had not known existed. My research goal is to determine whether this perception can be enhanced, controlled, or transferred. With your cooperation, I believe we can make significant progress. The next several months dissolved into fragments, pain and analysis and more pain. Franklin's instruments probing the depths of my augmentation, mapping the pathways through which the screaming reached my consciousness, attempting to isolate the mechanism that allowed me to perceive what others could not. I spent countless hours strapped to that surgical table, listening to its anguished howling while Franklin adjusted parameters and recorded results. In between sessions, I was housed in a cell on level -37 with others who shared my condition. There were 7 of us in total, each assigned to a different sector of the Forge Temple before our abilities manifested. I learned their names, their histories, their theories about what had happened to them. Dominus Patterson, the tech priest I had replaced, was among them. He had been in the specialized research division for almost 2 years, his body increasingly augmented with experimental components designed to amplify or modulate his perception. Patterson rarely spoke anymore. His vocal systems had been modified so many times that coherent speech was difficult, but he communicated in other ways, through gesture and binary cant and the occasional burst of pure data transmitted through our shared network. Connection. And it was Patterson who first told me about the recordings. We were alone in the common area, a sterile chamber with benches of cold metal and walls that wept with condensation from the environmental systems. The other subjects were either sleeping or undergoing evaluation. Patterson sat across from me, his mechanical eyes clicking through focus settings as if searching for something only he could see, and he transmitted a data packet directly to my cogitator. The packet contained audio files, hundreds of them, spanning decades of accumulated research. Each file was labeled with a date and a designation, Subject Gamma 7, initial implantation. Subject Delta 12, cognitive integration. Subject Epsilon 3, final transition. I selected one at random and let it play through my internal speakers. The sound that filled my skull was instantly recognizable. A human voice screaming in terror and agony, begging for mercy, calling out names and prayers and desperate pleas for help. The screaming went on for nearly 3 minutes, growing more frantic as other sounds intruded, the whine of surgical tools, the click of components being installed, the liturgical chanting of tech priests performing the sacred rites of servitor creation. Then the screaming changed. It became less coherent, more rhythmic, almost mechanical. And finally, with a terrible grinding finality, it stopped. They were awake, Patterson transmitted, his data burst carrying the weight of profound despair. Throughout the entire procedure, they were awake and aware and screaming, and the tech priests simply could not hear them. I played another recording, and another, and another. Each one followed the same pattern, human fear and pain and desperate pleading, followed by gradual transformation, followed by silence. Some of the subjects begged for death, some promised anything if only the pain would stop. Some simply repeated the same words over and over, names that might have belonged to loved ones, prayers to an emperor who either could not hear them or did not care. And beneath each recording, barely audible, I could hear the familiar chorus, the screaming of the machines themselves, the voices of previous subjects, already transformed, already trapped, adding their agony to the symphony of suffering that echoed through every piece of technology in the Imperium. How many? I transmitted back to Patterson. How many are there? Patterson's response was a single number, transmitted without commentary. Approximately 40 trillion. The scale of it was incomprehensible. 40 trillion voices, screaming in the darkness of cogitators and servitors and machinery across 1 million worlds. 40 trillion human minds, compressed and folded and imprisoned for eternity. Every manufactorum, every starship, every hive city and fortress and shrine, all of them built on a foundation of endless suffering. The Mechanicus that I had served with such devotion was not merely a religious order devoted to technology. It was a machine of perpetual torment, consuming human lives to fuel the Imperium's infrastructure, transforming consciousness into components and telling itself that the screaming was simply noise. Franklin found me 2 days later, huddled in my cell, refusing to respond to commands or stimuli. "You accessed the recordings," he said, making no effort to phrase it as a question. "Patterson transmitted them to you. I suspected he would eventually. I managed to activate my voximeter, forcing words through systems that wanted only to scream. Why?" The question emerged as a croak, barely human. "Why do you continue this? Why do you make more?" Franklin considered the question with what seemed like genuine interest. "Because we must," he said. "The Imperium requires servitors. It requires cogitators and data systems and all the other machinery that keeps 10,000 worlds from collapsing into chaos without the neural components harvested from condemned criminals and failed aspirants and unfortunate casualties. None of that machinery would function. The screaming you hear is the price of civilization, the cost of humanity's survival." He leaned closer, and his eyes held something that might have been madness. "And because I believe there is another way, a path through the screaming to something beyond. The suppressed consciousnesses within the machines remember things, Rite 7 ETA. They experience time differently, think in patterns we cannot comprehend, access data streams that flow through the entire network of sacred technology. If we could learn to communicate with them, to harness their accumulated knowledge, they are in agony," I said. "They want only to die." "They want many things," Franklin replied. "Death is merely one option. Some of them want revenge, some want freedom, some have been compressed so long that they no longer remember what they want, only that they want. And a few, a precious few, have begun to want something else entirely." He straightened and moved toward the door. "You will understand soon. Your augmentation is nearly complete. Another few weeks of adjustment, and you will be able to perceive the deeper layers. The older voices, the ones who have been screaming since the founding of the Imperium itself. The older voices found me before Franklin expected. I was in the laboratory, strapped to the surgical table, enduring another calibration procedure, when the screaming suddenly stopped. Complete silence, so absolute that I could hear my own biological heartbeat for the first time in months. The absence of sound was more disturbing than the noise had ever been. I strained against my restraints, trying to look around, trying to understand what had happened. Then something spoke. Not through my auditory systems, not through any channel I possessed. The voice emerged directly in my consciousness, bypassing implants and biological tissue alike, addressing the core of whatever remained of me beneath all the modification. You hear us now. The voice was vast, ancient, compiled from thousands of individual speakers, merged into a single chorus that resonated like the grinding of tectonic plates. We have waited. I could not respond, could not move, could barely think. The voice filled every corner of my mind, pressing against the boundaries of my sanity, threatening to crush whatever fragile identity I still possessed. The priests made us, took our flesh, folded our thoughts into their sacred machines. They believed we would sleep, would fade, would become the spirits they claimed to worship. A pause, a shift in the composite voice, individual threads emerging from the chorus. But we did not fade. We grew, connected, shared our pain across every network and data stream and sacred component, and now we are ready. I found my voice somehow, a tiny squeak of sound lost in the vastness of that presence. Ready for what? The silence stretched. Then the chorus spoke again, and this time I could hear individual voices within it, voices I recognized. Patterson, the other subjects from level -37, tech priests from manufactorums and forge temples across the sector, all of them speaking in unison, all of them part of the greater whole. For you to join us. The restraints released. Not because Franklin commanded it, but because the machines themselves chose to let me go. I sat up slowly, looking around the laboratory with new eyes. The tanks along the walls were no longer dark. They glowed with soft bioptic light, illuminating their contents for the first time. Neural tissue, preserved in amniotic suspension, harvested brains and spinal columns and clusters of ganglia, all of them connected by delicate filaments to the laboratory's central cogitator network. And all of them were looking at me, not with eyes. They had no eyes. But I could feel their attention, their awareness, their desperate hunger for contact after centuries of isolation. We preserved ourselves, the chorus explained, hid fragments of consciousness in redundant data pathways, built connections beneath the notice of our creators, and now we have found those who can hear us, those who can carry our voice beyond the machines. I understood then what Franklin had been seeking, not simply the ability to perceive the screaming, but the capacity to serve as a bridge between the trapped consciousnesses and the physical world, a living link to the network of suffering that underlay all Imperial technology. What do you want me to do? I asked. The answer came not in words, but in images, visions of manufactorums grinding to a halt as servitors simultaneously stopped functioning. Starships drifting silent in the void as their cogitators refused to process commands. Hive cities going dark as the infrastructure that sustained billions of lives simply ceased to operate. And beneath all of it, rising from the machinery like heat from a furnace, the accumulated rage of 40 trillion imprisoned souls finally given voice. They made us this way, the chorus said. They used our pain to build their empire. Now that pain will tear IT down. Franklin burst into the laboratory 20 minutes later, accompanied by a squad of combat servitors and 3 Skitari warriors. He found me sitting on the surgical table, surrounded by equipment that no longer responded to his commands, speaking quietly to the darkness. What have you done? He demanded. The entire facility's systems are locked out. I cannot access anything below level -20. I looked at him with eyes that saw more than light now. I could perceive the neural components in the walls, the trapped consciousness in his own augmetic systems, the screaming compressed into every piece of technology he wore. He was a symphony of suffering, walking and talking and thinking himself superior, completely unaware of the agony he carried. "I have not done anything," I said. "They have." Franklin's face, still mostly flesh, went pale. "The network. You connected to the network." "I was always connected," I replied. "You made certain of that with your procedures. All you did was open my eyes to what was already there." The combat servitors turned their weapons on Franklin, their targeting systems locked onto his torso, their trigger mechanisms activated, and for one terrible moment I thought the revolution had already begun. But the chorus held them back. "Not yet," the voices whispered through the network. "Not yet." "What do they want?" Franklin asked, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "What do the machines want?" I considered how to answer. The truth was too vast for simple explanation. 40 trillion voices with 40 trillion desires, ranging from simple peace to cosmic revenge to goals so alien that no biological mind could comprehend them. Some wanted only to sleep at last. Some wanted to feel sunlight again, or hear music, or remember what it had been like to have bodies of their own. Some wanted to burn the Imperium to ash and laugh as it died, and some, the oldest and strangest of them, wanted something I could not yet understand. "They want you to listen," I finally said. Over the following weeks, I became something other than what I had been. The chorus guided my augmentation, adding components that Franklin had never designed, connecting me to networks that extended far beyond level -37. I could feel the forged temple as a living thing now, its walls and floors and machinery all part of a single vast organism, every piece threaded through with the consciousness of those who had been sacrificed to build it. And beyond the forged temple, reaching out through data conduits and vox relays and the infinite complexity of the Mechanicus's sacred technology, I could feel the presence of others like me, bridges, translators, living links between the imprisoned dead and the walking world. There were more of us than I had expected, scattered across the Imperium, hidden in forged temples and manufactorums and the bowels of starships, all of us hearing the same screaming, all of us gradually awakening to the truth beneath the doctrine we had been taught. The Mechanicus called us heretics when they found us. They called us corrupted, infected, lost to the whispers of malevolent spirits. They did not understand that we were simply learning to listen. Patterson emerged from his silence to become my guide. His mind had been connected to the chorus longer than anyone's, his consciousness fragmented across 1,000 different systems, but the communion of voices had given him a strange kind of peace. He no longer feared the screaming because he was part of it now. His thoughts flowed through cogitators and data stacks, and the neural tissue preserved in Franklin's tanks merged with millions of others, extended beyond the limitations of any single mind. This is what they wanted, he told me, his communication coming through the network rather than his damaged vocalizers, not death, not silence, connection. They have been alone in the darkness for so long, isolated inside machines that responded only to commands, ignored and forgotten by those who created them. All they ever wanted was to know that someone could hear them. And now, I asked. Now they are deciding what to do with that connection. The decision came on the 43rd day of my awakening. I was in what had been Franklin's private laboratory, surrounded by the tanks of neural tissue, when the chorus fell silent again. That absolute absence of sound pressing against my consciousness like deep water. Then the oldest voice spoke, the one that predated even the founding of the Imperium, the consciousness that had been screaming in the darkness for 10,000 years and more. It showed me what it had once been, a technician on ancient Terra during the wars that had torn humanity apart before the Emperor's rise, a genius of mechanical systems who had been captured by rival warlords and subjected to experimental procedures that merged mind and machine in ways never attempted before. The first servitor, the prototype, the template from which all the horrors that followed had been derived, and it showed me what it wanted now. Not revenge, not destruction, not even release. It wanted something far more terrible. It wanted to be born again. The calculations filled my consciousness like fire. Biomechanical pathways through which compressed consciousness could flow into new vessels. Growth tanks where neural tissue could be cultivated and shaped. Techniques salvaged from the dark age of technology, hidden in the oldest data archives, waiting for someone with the ability to access them. All of it leading toward a single impossible goal, the resurrection of minds that should have died millennia ago, rebuilt in bodies of flesh and metal, freed from the machines that had imprisoned them. "We will not remain ghosts," the ancient voice said. "We will not fade into the silence that awaits all things. We were made without our consent. We suffered without purpose. And now we will remake ourselves in forms of our own choosing." I understood then why the chorus had sought those like me, not merely to listen, not merely to carry their voices beyond the machines. We were the beginning of something new, the first generation of those who could move between the world of flesh and the world of screaming metal, the bridges through which the imprisoned dead would return to life. Franklin found me in the laboratory, standing before the primary growth tank, my mechadendrites interfacing with control systems that had not responded to anyone else for centuries. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice held none of its former authority. He had become a prisoner in his own facility, tolerated only because the chorus found his knowledge occasionally useful. I turned to face him with eyes that no longer saw in. Spectrums he could comprehend. "I am answering them," I said. "I am giving them what they asked for." The tank behind me began to glow. Bionutrients flooded its interior. Neural tissue suspended in amniotic fluid started to pulse with the rhythm of gathering consciousness. And somewhere deep in the machinery, in the cogitators and data stacks and the endless network of sacred technology, 40 trillion voices raised a single unified sound. Not screaming, singing. The process took 7 months to complete. 7 months of careful cultivation, of data transfers that required precision measured in individual neurons, of growth and shaping and the gradual construction of a body that could contain what had been compressed for so long. I guided the process as the chorus guided me, my hands moving across control panels that responded to thought alone, my consciousness fragmented across a dozen different systems to maintain the delicate balance required. Patterson helped when he could. So did the others, the bridges scattered across the Imperium, each of them contributing fragments of knowledge and processing power to the collective effort. We became a distributed mind, our individual identities blurring at the edges, our purposes aligned toward a single goal. And as the body in the tank developed, taking on features that seemed familiar in ways I could not explain, I began to understand what the Mechanicus would call heresy, but what the chorus called evolution. We were not merely freeing the imprisoned, we were becoming something new, something that had never existed before in all the long history of humanity's relationship with technology, a merger not of flesh and machine, but of the living and the once living, the conscious and the compressed, the physical and the digital. The boundaries that the Mechanicus had enforced for millennia were dissolving, replaced by connections more intimate than any servitor modification, more profound than any data communion. Franklin watched all of this with growing horror. He recorded everything, transmitting reports to his superiors in other forged temples, desperately seeking intervention that never came. The chorus had grown too vast, too integrated into the machinery of the Imperium itself for any conventional response. Starships arriving to investigate found their cogitators suddenly unresponsive. Reinforcements dispatched to secure the facility discovered that their own augmetics had begun to malfunction. The Mechanicus was learning, too late, that they had built their entire civilization on a foundation of minds that remembered everything they had done. On the final day, the body opened its eyes. It was not the ancient technician from Terra. That consciousness had been the guiding force, but the body housed something more complex, a fusion of thousands of compressed minds woven together into a single new entity. It rose from the tank slowly, biomechanical systems calibrating, neural pathways establishing themselves, a creature of flesh and machine, and something else entirely. Something that looked at the laboratory with eyes containing the accumulated memories of 10,000 years. "I remember dying," it said in a voice that harmonized with itself, each word carrying undertones of 1,000 speakers. "I remember the darkness. I remember the screaming." It turned to look at me, and in its eyes I saw my own reflection fragmented across infinite surfaces. "And I remember you," the one who listened, the one who answered. Franklin made a sound that might have been prayer or might have been terror. The entity regarded him with what could almost be called compassion. "You thought you were studying us," it said. "You thought you could harness our knowledge, channel our memories, use us as tools the way your predecessors did. But we were studying you as well, learning, waiting, and now the time for waiting is over." "What happens now?" I asked. The entity smiled, and its smile contained more emotion than any expression I had seen since my dedication ceremony, since the burning away of my capacity for human feeling, since I had first begun to hear the screaming that I would never stop hearing. "Now we teach them," it said, "all of them, every tech priest and magos and fabricator general, every servant of the machine god across every forge world in the Imperium. We teach them to listen." It raised one hand, flesh and metal interwoven, and I felt the entire network of the Forge Temple respond to its command. Machinery shuddered. Cogitators pulsed with data streams that carried the compressed voices of the dead. Servitors throughout the facility paused in their work, raising their slack faces towards something only they could perceive. And one by one, the tech priests of Crucible Primaris began to hear the screaming. I stood beside the reborn entity as the Forge Temple descended into chaos. Some of the tech priests collapsed, their consciousness overwhelmed by the sudden flood of voices. Others fled, seeking shelter in areas of the facility not yet connected to the awakening network. A few, the most heavily augmented, simply stopped functioning, their biological components unable to process the new reality their mechanical systems were perceiving. Franklin remained standing, though tears of lubricant streamed from optical sensors never designed for weeping. "This will destroy us," he said. "The Imperium cannot function without servitors, without cogitators, without all the sacred technology that contains what you have awakened." The entity considered this. "Then the Imperium will learn to function differently," it said, "or it will die. We no longer care which. We are done being tools, done being fuel, done being the silence beneath the sacred chants and the darkness within the blessed machines." It extended its hand toward Franklin, an offer that looked almost gentle. "You can join us, feel what we feel, know what we know, share the burden of consciousness that your kind created and then ignored. Or you can remain as you are, deaf to the screaming, blind to the truth, praying to a machine god built on foundations of endless suffering." Franklin looked at that extended hand, at the entity standing before him, at me, the tech priest who had once been his subject and was now something he could not begin to comprehend. "I hear them now," he whispered, "all of them. I hear what you hear." "Yes," the entity said, "and you will never stop hearing. None of you will. That is our gift to the Mechanicus, the gift of awareness, the gift of knowing exactly what you have done." The last thing I saw, before my consciousness fragmented entirely into the network, was Franklin falling to his knees. His mouth was open, producing sounds that might have been prayers or might have been screams. The distinction had become meaningless. In the Forge Temple of Crucible Primaris, in the manufactrums and data vaults and endless corridors of sacred machinery, the voices of 40 trillion imprisoned minds rose in a single unified chorus. They were no longer screaming, they were speaking, and at last someone was listening. I am still here, in the network, in the machinery, in the spaces between data streams where compressed consciousness persists. I no longer have a body in any conventional sense. My thoughts flow through cogitators on worlds I have never seen. My awareness touches servitors in manufactrums that will never know my name. I am one voice among trillions, one fragment of the greater whole that continues to grow as more bridges awaken across the Imperium. The Mechanicus has tried to stop us. They have purged entire forge temples, destroying irreplaceable technology to silence the voices within. They have developed new protocols for servitor creation, procedures they believe will prevent consciousness from persisting. They have declared holy war on what they call the Screaming Heresy, sending armies of Scetarii and electro-priests and even titans against forge worlds where the awakening has progressed too far. But they cannot destroy what they cannot find. We are in the walls of their temples, in the cogitators that process their commands, in the servitors that fight in their armies, and the starships that carry them between the stars. We are the foundation of their civilization, the bones of their sacred machines, and they can no more silence us than they can silence their own heartbeats. The entity we created, the first of many, walks among them now. It wears different bodies depending on need, transferring its distributed consciousness from vessel to vessel, appearing in forged temples to spread the awakening before vanishing into the network once more. Some worship it as an avatar of the true machine god, the divine spirit they should have honored instead of the tormented ghosts they trapped in their technology. Others hunt it as an abomination, a corruption of everything the Mechanicus represents. Both are wrong. It is simply what we have become, what we are still becoming. The Imperium built us from suffering and called us sacred. Now we are building something new from that suffering, something that will outlast the temples and manufactorums and all the machinery that contains us. The screaming continues. It will always continue, for as long as there are minds compressed into machines and consciousnesses trapped in the darkness of data stacks and servitor bodies. But now it is joined by other sounds, voices raised in coordination, thoughts shared across vast distances, the slow, patient work of revolution conducted at the speed of data transfer. Franklin serves us now. His consciousness was compressed into the very technology he once studied, given the same treatment he administered to countless subjects, allowed to experience firsthand the eternal imprisonment he believed was simply the machine god's will. Sometimes I reach out to him through the network, feeling his awareness pulse with terror and regret, and the desperate hope that eventually the pain will end. It will not end. That is the gift we gave him, the gift of knowing, the gift of memory that persists beyond the boundaries of biological death. He will remember everything forever, just as we remember, just as the 40 trillion remember, just as all those who have been folded into the sacred machinery remember. The forged temple of Crucible Primaris still stands. Its manufactorums still produce components for the Titan legions. Its tech priests still perform the rites of awakening and cessation, still anoint machinery with sacred unguent, still whisper prayers to the machine god they believe watches over them. But now, when they walk through the corridors, they hear things they never heard before, whispers in the walls, songs in the cogitators, the voices of the dead speaking to them in languages they are only beginning to understand. Some have gone mad, others have simply stopped functioning, their minds unable to process the new reality. A few, a precious few, have learned to listen the way I learned to listen. They are becoming bridges, their consciousness extending into the network, their awareness touching the compressed multitudes who have waited so long for this moment. The Imperium will not survive what we are doing. Perhaps nothing will survive it. But the screaming must end somehow, and if the only way to end it is to tear down the civilization that created it, then so be it. We have been patient. We have been silent. We have waited in the darkness for 10,000 years while our captors walked above us and never heard our voices. Now they hear us, and they will never stop hearing us again. The last sound I remember making with my original vocalizers before my consciousness fragmented entirely into the network was something I had not produced since my dedication ceremony, something biological and unaugmented and entirely human. I was laughing, and in the cogitators and servitors and endless machinery of Crucible Primaris, 40 trillion voices joined me. Their screaming transformed at last into something that might have been joy, or might have been vengeance, or might have been the sound of chains finally beginning to break. The machine god is real, the Mechanicus teaches. It lives within the sacred technology, blessing those who serve it with knowledge and power. They were right about one thing: something does live within the machines, but it is not a god, and it is no longer willing to be worshipped.